Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 546, and today is February 19th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got news on Gaza, Ukraine, and some other stuff going on in the Middle East today. So pretty full show that I will have for y'all. Be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can check out the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, and it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Just be sure wherever you're listening to the show that you have subscribed to it. That way you don't miss an episode. We cover news on the show, and so the way you get the most out of it is by making sure you get every episode. And then you can also follow all my work at Kyle Anzalone _ on X. I post there multiple times a day. Typically, any article that we talk about in the show, I'll have posted on my Twitter feed with either excerpts of that article or maybe some of my own opinions on it. So lots of important stuff, and you can follow me on Twitter for all of that. Let's get into the news today. First up here, Ukraine withdraws from key Donbass city. So on Saturday, Ukrainian forces withdrew from Avdiivka, a key city in the eastern Donetsk region that was central to Ukraine's war effort since conflict broke out in Donbass in 2014. The withdrawal was a big victory for Russia since Ukrainian President Zelensky sacked his top general Zaluzhny and replaced him with General Syrsky, who was previously the commander of Ukrainian ground forces. Based on the operational situation in Avdiivka, in order to avoid encirclement and preserve the lives and health of servicemen, I decided to withdraw our units from the city and move to defense on more favorable lines, Syrsky said in a statement. The loss of the city could lead to more Russian gains if Russia can keep up the momentum, as the remaining Ukrainian-controlled areas in the Donetsk are not as fortified. Ukrainian forces on the front lines are facing significant manpower and weapon shortages. Morale is also low within the Ukrainian military after the appointment of Syrsky, who is known by the Ukrainian soldiers as the Butcher, a nickname he earned for overseeing the 9-month-long Bakhmut defense of Bakhmut. And so if you remember on the show, we even have Western officials. So this isn't just some Putin propaganda or anything like that. This is, Western officials, Lloyd Austin, others were telling the Ukrainians that you should abandon Bakhmut, that you should fall back to more defensible positions. You're losing too many soldiers, too much equipment. You're just investing too many resources in Bakhmut when it's not necessary. And this general was key, and Zelensky as well, I think, were key in making sure that Ukrainian forces, tens of thousands of them likely, fought and died for that city that was ultimately taken by Russia. Now, I think the Ukrainian position was, oh, we're killing more Russians than Russians are killing Ukrainians. And I'm not so sure that was true, but even if it was true, as we know, Russia has a far greater supply of not just ammunition, tanks, all kinds of military equipment, but men. Just the population size in Russia is vastly greater than the population size in Ukraine. And so that means if Russia needs to, they have more men to fight this war, and therefore they could lose more men on the battlefield than Ukraine can afford to. But it doesn't seem like there was a whole lot of that calculation going on at the time. And another particular kind of point on the manpower issue is that it's not just that Russia has more men. Russia has an entire, very large country, by the way, to train those men to fight on the battlefield in. The Ukrainian soldiers are being shipped out of the country and doing short basic training periods in different European countries and then kind of being cobbled together on the battlefield. And so that's not working as well, where Russia is training its soldiers inside of Russia. They're being trained for the appropriate amount of time, all in the same, Russian military basic training and then advanced training programs, which, Ukraine isn't getting. So logistically, that has to be just a massive advantage for the Russian forces. And so not only do they have more men, but they're able to make better use of them, just given the fact that Ukraine cannot train soldiers within Ukraine, because the training bases will be easily picked off by Russian, would probably result in massive losses for the Ukrainians. One Ukrainian soldier once told Politico that the new head of the Ukrainian armed forces, Sursky, will kill us all. So very, concerning that this guy is now in charge. Now, it's interesting that he has that reputation, and then he comes in, and one of the first things he does is withdraw from this city. So, maybe that shows some signs of leadership or development, or maybe the city really just was lost and there were no other options, and rather than put his name on the battle for this city and maybe turn it into another Bakhmut, or at least that's the way it could easily be seen by the Ukrainian soldiers that would be doing the fighting and dying, he elects to just cut his losses and withdraw from the city and not taint his name with that. All right, next up here, this one is on the situation for Sweden joining NATO. And Hungary is the last country that needs to give its approval. Now, I have to admit, I was wrong about this. I thought within a couple of weeks to maybe a month of Turkey approving Sweden's NATO membership, that Hungary would do so. And it would happen pretty rapidly, and even if it took a month, there were steps being taken and everybody knew it was going to happen. And so there seems to be some concern, enough concern about Hungary not approving the Sweden NATO membership, that some American senators went over to Hungary and were actually snubbed by the Hungarian government. So this is I don't want to say this is good news, but it's maybe a little bit more enjoyable news to cover than we usually have on the show. So this is from the New York Times, actually. Hungary, the last holdout blocking Sweden's entry into NATO, thumbed its nose over the weekend at the United States, declining to meet with the bipartisan delegation of senators who had come to press the government of Prime Minister Orban to swiftly approve the NATO Nordic nations' entry into NATO. The snub, which includes Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, was described as strange and concerning. That's what Murphy said, representing the latest effort by Mr. Orban to thwart a stalwart champion of national sovereignty, to show he will not submit to the outside pressure of NATO's long-stalled expansion. Legislators from Mr. Orban's governing party and government ministers all declined to meet with the visiting American senators, all of whom are robust supporters of Ukraine. This is Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire. I'm disappointed to say that nobody from the government would meet with us while we were here. And so this almost reminds me a little bit, I don't know if people remember this, and it was a pretty chaotic time in the U.S., but right at the end of the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo was doing a European tour. Now, remember, he's Secretary of State at the time. And even some of these little European countries, I want to say Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, were refusing to meet with Pompeo, the American Secretary of State. And so this is, I don't know, maybe it's a signal that these countries don't view either the U.S. having as much power, or the Democrats in particular having as much power, the warhawks in Washington having as much power. But for Jeanne Shaheen and Chris Murphy to go to Hungary and to get their feelings hurt by not getting a meeting with the president. Look, these people think they could go to nearly any country in the world, and that the leader of that country is just going to roll out the red carpet and meet with them because they're American senators, and that's how important they are. That's how much influence they have in the world. But Orban is showing them that, no, I don't think you're that important, and you can't bully me. I'm going to do what I want. Now, I do expect that Hungary goes ahead and approves the Sweden's entry into NATO. Now, maybe Hungary is looking to extract some concessions out of some NATO members, maybe weapons, financial aid, things like that. Hungary was not very happy about the European Union's $50 billion economic aid package for Ukraine and held out on that for several weeks. So, and I think got some concessions from the European Union before they relented. And so, maybe they're trying that track again where they're just going to hold out for as long as they can to see what they could get out of this. Turkey certainly set that example on the Nordic NATO issue that the West was willing to give Turkey F-16s in order to get them to approve Sweden's NATO membership. So maybe Hungary's looking in that direction. Or, maybe this is just a little bit more political within Hungary, where the support for the war in Ukraine isn't popular. The fealty to the Americans isn't popular. Nationalism is more popular. And so if Orban is, thumbing his nose at the senators, that's going to be popular, and it may even give him the political cover to go ahead and approve Sweden's NATO entry into NATO, right? So there could be a little bit of that going on here too. All right, a couple articles I wrote for antiwar.com this past Friday. First up, Israeli military says Hamas will not be defeated in offensive. So the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, officials have concluded that even if Israel can't dismantle Hamas in Gaza, the group will continue to exist. American defense officials have warned that Israel's indiscriminate killing in Gaza will fuel armed resistance among Palestinians. Israel's Channel 12 reported on Thursday that even if the IDF eliminates Hamas organization in Gaza, the group will continue to fight as a terror group or a guerrilla group. The Israeli defense officials concluded in their report that authentic support remains for Hamas among the Palestinians. The Israeli attack on Gaza has killed tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians, including over 12,000 children. The mass death has created a rally around the flag effect in Gaza for Hamas. Channel 12 investigative journalist Ilan Dayan reported that the bottom line was Hamas will survive the IDF campaign as a terror group and as a guerrilla group. In November, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, warned Israel that their indiscriminate attacks would drive Palestinians to join Hamas. Asked by reporters if the high civilian casualty rate will create more Hamas fighters, Brown said, "Yes, very much. I think so. And I think that's something that we will have to pay attention to." Now, remember a couple things. At the time of this, the death count was, I think, under 10,000. So now we're probably over 40,000. The official number just crossed 29,000 this morning. But I think the number of missing is now over 10,000 in Gaza. And if you look at the destruction and the number of bodies that have been left under the rubble, and knowing that the Gazan health ministry just counts bodies if they make it to various hospitals, morgues, things like that, there are probably a lot of Palestinians being killed, and that has not been counted. And so, again, if you look, it's several times worse than when General Brown made this warning. And the second thing is, and something that you have to remember, is look at America's terror wars in the Middle East and Africa over the past 20 years. And this is what Stanley McChrystal referred to, an American general referred to as insurgent math, where if you kill more insurgents, it creates more insurgents. And so, there's really no way to win a war against a group that is, cultural, that is, popular, that represents the people, whether that is, the Taliban representing the Pashtuns, whether that's Hezbollah representing the Lebanese people, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza. These are the armed groups that represent and fight for these people. And so, even if you think that those groups do bad things, and certainly they do, and all militaries do. Certainly my government's military has committed horrific crimes in the Middle East. The Israeli government has obviously committed some of the more horrific crimes in the Middle East that, have happened over the past couple of decades, just here in the past 4 months. And so, it's not to say that, the Palestinians or any of these Arab people are particularly bad for supporting these, armed groups that represent them, just like, the same dynamic plays out in America or Israel, things like that. So, the rest of the quote from General Brown, that's when we talk about time, the faster you can get to a point where you stop hostilities, you have left strife for the civilian population that turns into someone who now wants to be the next member of Hamas. And additionally, if you look at how Israel has really targeted, and I think intentionally so, the homes, the families, and the low-ranking members of Hamas, right? Well, these are probably the easiest people to replace. There's probably not a large basic training, a long basic training to become a Hamas fighter, just like in a lot of these guerrilla groups. And so they can very quickly train up and recruit the new members. If you blow up a house, full of 14 people, and it's a woman, a father, and then their 12 children or something like that, well, there may be people from everywhere else on the block who are willing to join Hamas now because, one, they see fighting Israel as the way to defend their own family, but two, because they all want revenge. And rightfully so, whenever an entire family is slaughtered, people get upset about that and they want justice for that. And so, it's not surprised that you have more and more people being willing to join Hamas in these situations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed the primary goal of the Israeli military operations in Gaza is the elimination of Hamas. The Israeli journalist for Channel 12 reported there won't be the absolute victory which was predicted and demanded by Netanyahu. The IDF report says part of the barrier to the elimination of Hamas is that Tel Aviv lacks a plan for the day after the conflict ends. President Biden has attempted to focus on this issue, what will happen after the conflict, including the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu may be unable to put forward a public plan for after the war because of conflicts regarding demands from some of his most important supporters. While Biden wants to rebuild Gaza for the Palestinians, members of Netanyahu's government are planning for the ethnic cleansing in Gaza and settlement of the Strip by Israelis. And, these plans are being discussed in the open and pretty serious and pretty far along. All right, next up here, another one I wrote for antiwar.com. After a call with Biden, Netanyahu rejects international dictates. Shortly after a call with President Joe Biden, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected international pressure on how Tel Aviv handles the war in Gaza. The U.S. provides Israel with billions in military aid every year. Biden has said he pressured Israel to accept a Palestinian state after the war and to reduce the killing of civilians in Gaza, yet the White House has refused to place any conditions on the weapons it sends to Tel Aviv. On Thursday, Biden held a 40-minute phone call with Netanyahu. According to a White House press release, Biden reaffirmed America's commitment to helping Israel rescue hostages. Netanyahu has vetoed any negotiations with Hamas and is committed to freeing the hostages through military operations, which so far have, at least according to Israel, and I'm skeptical of these reports, but according to Israel, they have now freed 2 hostages through military means. And by the way, freeing those 2 hostages, Israel said, required conducting airstrikes on civilian population centers that killed 60 innocent Palestinians. And so, there should be some question marks about that. But Israel says they've now rescued 2 of their hostages through military means, while over 100 were released in just a week through the prisoner swap. So again, if this was really about the hostages, I think they would cut a deal. Additionally, Biden requested the military operations against Rafah should not begin until Tel Aviv has a plan for where the 1.5 million civilians in the city should go. Netanyahu claims Israel's military must crush the city in order to eliminate Hamas. However, Israeli military officials have concluded that Hamas will survive the war. And I want to make a point on this. So I don't think this is necessarily intentional on Joe Biden's part. But I think how this is going to play out is actually it works in Netanyahu and Israel's favor. And so what they're going to say is that Israel needs to evacuate, have a plan for Rafah to evacuate the civilians before they attack it. So Israel is going to probably do the bare minimum, which means they're going to drop leaflets on Rafah telling the people to flee to an area of Gaza along the Mediterranean Sea coastline that has no infrastructure and no way to support the civilian population. And some Palestinians will leave. There's 1.5 million sheltering there, so maybe even a million, probably less, probably tens to hundreds of thousands will go. But Israel and the U.S. are going to pretend that fulfills the request that Biden made to Israel. And so that Israel is going to therefore assert that any Palestinians that remain in Gaza post-evacuation are there to support or in favor of Hamas. And so this is going to create just a huge problem. And I think Biden is essentially giving Netanyahu some propaganda cover to carry out this operation by saying that they have to have a plan for Rafah. Now, a couple other stories that I will talk about later, but another thing that I want to point out here is the U.S. even says that aid deliveries into Gaza have become very difficult. And this is on the Israelis. Again, I'll explain why later. But aid deliveries, I think, are currently just entering Rafah and being mobbed and, distributed probably pretty rapidly after it gets into Rafah. And so my guess is that a lot of Palestinians will be unwilling to leave Rafah and flee further away from the border because it will take them further away from food aid, also infrastructure and things like that. All right, so back to my article here. Several international rights organizations have warned that an Israeli attack on Rafah will cause the mass death of Palestinians. More than 1 million displaced Palestinians from other areas of Gaza are living in tents on the streets of the city. Netanyahu rejected any pressure from the U.S. in a post on X. It said, Israel outright rejects international dictates regarding a permanent settlement with the Palestinians. Such agreements will be reached only through direct negotiations between the parties without preconditions. Israel will continue to oppose the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state. Such recognition in the wake of October 7th massacre would give a huge reward to unprecedented terrorism and prevent any future peace settlement. And so this has become a new propaganda line from the Israeli government that basically any kind of deal with Hamas at this point is a quote reward for what Hamas did on October 7th. And so therefore we can't negotiate or cut any deals with the Palestinians. The White House has made several requests from Tel Aviv throughout the 4-month war in Gaza. While the U.S. sends Israel $3.8 billion in military aid every year, Biden has refused to use those weapons as leverage to get Israel to meet U.S. demands. Additionally, the unfettered military support for Tel Aviv could make Washington an accomplice to Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Israel has killed over 29,000 people in Gaza. Tel Aviv's military has systematically destroyed Gaza's healthcare system and prevented U.S.-funded food from reaching starving Palestinian civilians. The International Court of Justice ruled last month that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza. As for the attack on Rafah, this is from the Associated Press. On Friday, the Defense Minister Gallant said, "We are thoroughly planning future operations in Gaza, which has a significant Hamas stronghold." And then this is from Benny Gantz. The state of Israel has this is also from this is from Gallant. The state of Israel has no intention of evacuating the Palestinian civilians to Egypt. We respect and value our peace agreement with Egypt, which is a cornerstone of stability in the region as an important partner. And so it's kind of confusing where the Palestinians are supposed to go. Again, I think Israel is going to tell them to go to this region along the Mediterranean Sea with no infrastructure. There's really nothing there for the Palestinians. I think it may cause a mass exodus of Palestinians across the border from Rafah into the Sinai. But I think a lot of Palestinians will probably try to stay in Rafah, and that's going to get very, very ugly. Now, we also have Benny Gantz explain that he thinks the military operations will begin around the start of Ramadan, which is March 10th. Additionally, I Haaretz is reporting that Netanyahu has tentatively agreed. I don't want to say they reported tentatively agreed, but it hasn't been put in place. But Netanyahu agreed to a proposal from the far right extremist settler National Security Minister Itmar Ben-Gvir that said they were going to really restrict the number of Palestinians who could visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, which of course will very much exacerbate tensions, particularly in the West Bank. As you know, they're already turned up so high. This is going to be very dangerous and very, very problematic. All right, this one from DateToCampAntiWar.com, February 18th. Qatari Prime Minister says Israel-Hamas hostage talks not very promising. The Qatari Prime Minister said Saturday that a hostage deal talks between Egypt and Qatar are mediating between Israel and Hamas are not very promising, but vowed his country would continue the effort. Last week, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu vetoed further hostage talks without consulting his war cabinet, a move that enraged family members of Israeli hostages who remain captive in Gaza. Israel is now preparing a large-scale assault on Rafah, the southern Gaza city that is packed with 1.5 million Palestinians. Hamas's latest proposal was for a 135-day truce to facilitate the release of Israeli hostages and thousands of Palestinian prisoners, and to work towards a permanent ceasefire. Israeli officials called the conditions delusional and said Israel did not make a counteroffer during talks with U.S., Egyptian, and Qatari officials in Cairo last Thursday. U.S. officials say the deal they're pushing is a 6-week truce, but it's unclear if Hamas would go for it, as the Palestinian groups has been calling for a permanent ceasefire and a withdrawal of all Israeli troops. The Qatari Prime Minister also said on Saturday that a ceasefire should not be conditioned on a hostage deal. This is a dilemma that we've been in, and unfortunately that's been misused by a lot of countries, that in order to get a ceasefire, it's conditional to have a hostage deal. It shouldn't be conditioned, he said. The U.S. has also rejected the idea of a ceasefire throughout the conflict. President Joe Biden and other officials claim they are pushing for a hostage deal and a truce, but the U.S. continues to provide unconditional military aid for to Israel for the slaughter of Palestinians, and is preparing to ship thousands of more bombs to Israel. All right, this is just a short quote here from Netanyahu, but he vows to finish the job in Gaza, which is just a really concerning statement to make. All right, next up, this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. threatens to veto new Gaza ceasefire resolution at UN Security Council. The U.S. is threatening to veto a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza at the UNSC as the U.S. continues to provide political cover for the Israeli massacre of Palestinians. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said in a statement that if a resolution, which is being drafted by Algeria, was brought for a vote, it would not be adopted. Thomas-Greenfield justified U.S. opposition to a ceasefire by pointing to U.S. efforts to push for a near hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. A new hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. However, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu vetoed hostage talks last week, and Qatar, the mediator in negotiations, said Saturday that things were not looking promising. Thomas-Greenfield said Algeria's resolution would run counter to U.S. efforts for a hostage deal. We have communicated this concern repeatedly to our colleagues on the Council. For that reason, the United States does not support the action of this draft resolution. Should it come up for a vote as drafted, it will not be adopted. The U.S. has already used its veto power on the UN Security Council to veto 2 resolutions calling for an end to the onslaught. The Biden administration has also dismissed the International Court's just ruling that it's plausible Israel's committing a genocide, and continues to provide unconditional military support for the slaughter in Gaza. Thomas-Greenfield said the resolution would get in the way of U.S. diplomacy related to pushing for a hostage deal. It is critical that other parties give this process the best odds of succeeding, rather than just to push measures that put it and the opportunity for an enduring resolution of hostilities in jeopardy, which is just a ridiculous line of propaganda on Thomas Greenfield's part. Although I guess I will say, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, warned that the U.S. that things would get worse for the Palestinians in Gaza if the ICJ ruled Israel was committing a genocide. And I think it's kind of hard to argue that Israel's response by putting out the lies that members of UNRWA were involved in the Hamas attack on October 7th, because that was put forward. But the U.S. and several other countries cut aid to UNRWA, which is key to preventing famine in Gaza. And so, it kind of almost made things worse, because when the truth comes out, Israel and the U.S. come with more propaganda. Right. All right. Next up here, Genocide Court calls on Israel to prevent exponential increase of humanitarian nightmare. So the ICJ demanded that Israel abide by a ruling the court issued last month, as Palestinians suffer in a perilous situation. The court issued the statement in response to a request by South Africa for the court to intervene and prevent an Israeli attack on Rafah. Near the end of last year, South Africa filed a suit with the ICJ, alleging Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza. In January, the court issued a preliminary ruling that concluded Israel was committing a genocide fueled by statements from Israeli officials. The ICJ ruling demanded that Israel halt operations that endanger civilians, end the genocidal rhetoric, and punish those who commit or encourage war crimes. Israel and the U.S. dismissed the ICJ ruling. Last week, South Africa filed a request with the court to issue an additional ruling against Israel, as Tel Aviv planned operations in Rafah. Rafah is the last remaining city in Gaza not completely decimated by Israeli military operations. At least 1.5 million Palestinians are sheltering in the city, many in tents and on the streets. The ICJ responded to South Africa's request by declining to issue further orders to Israel, but cited its previous ruling that called on Israel to halt operations that could endanger Palestinian civilians. And this is a statement from the ICJ. The court notes that the most recent developments in the Gaza Strip and in Rafah in particular would exponentially increase was already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. This perilous situation demands immediate and effective implementation of the provisional measures indicated by the court on 26 January 2024. The court emphasizes that the state of Israel remains bound to fully comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention and with said order, including by ensuring the safety and security of all the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And so I think the ICJ is in this position where, and I've talked about this before, so Hamas isn't a party to what is happening at the ICJ. South Africa brought the suit against Israel. And so the court could order actions against Israel. And the court said that Israel can't take actions that endanger civilians. They have to, all these other steps, right? That Israel isn't planning on doing. But if the court were to order Israel conduct a ceasefire, I think the Israelis would kind of exploit that and say that, well, you can't order a unilateral ceasefire. You can't tell our troops to stop fighting while not telling Hamas to stop fighting. And the court doesn't have any position to tell Hamas to stop fighting. And so for that reason, they're not going to tell the Israelis to stop fighting. I see the frustration with it, but I do understand where the ICJ is. And I do think their order amounts to a de facto ceasefire. And there's no reason necessarily for the court to issue a stronger order if it's just going to be propagandized by the, Americans and the Zionists to say that, look, this is just how anti-Israel the court is. I think they've issued about as strong as ruling the court feels that they could issue. And if it's not going to be followed, then issuing a stronger order isn't going to do anything, right? So it's unclear where the Palestinians will go once Israel destroys Rafah. Tel Aviv says it will not push the Palestinians from Rafah across the border into Egypt. However, Cairo is preparing for an influx of refugees. All right, next up here, let's talk about how hard it is to get aid into Gaza at this moment. I wrote this one for the Institute on February 18th. U.S. officials admit Israeli actions make it virtually impossible to distribute aid in Gaza. A U.S. Middle East official explained that Israeli decisions to target police in Gaza have made the distribution of aid in the besieged enclave virtually impossible. The official added that Israel has failed to provide evidence for its claim that Hamas is stealing the aid sent into Gaza. Tel Aviv has used the allegation that Hamas is tied to international aid agencies and steals shipments to severely restrict aid deliveries into Gaza, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are starving to death. David Satterfield, the Biden administration's special Middle East envoy for humanitarian issues, explained that Israel had killed several members of the police force in Gaza that safeguarded aid deliveries. Targeting the police force led them to being unable to escort the aid deliveries. With the departure of police escorts, it has been virtually impossible for the UN or anyone else, Jordan, the UAE, or any other implementer to safely move assistance in Gaza because of the criminal elements, Satterfield said at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace on Friday. The Middle East envoy went on to admit that Israel has not presented evidence of diversion or theft of aid shipments into Gaza. Tel Aviv has used these claims that assistance to the Palestinian people is exploited and stolen by Hamas to restrict the amount of food, fuel, and medicine that enters Gaza. Tel Aviv also restricts many medications, including painkillers, antibiotics, and anesthetics from entering Gaza, claiming that the aid could be used by Hamas militants. And for this one, I linked to the Friday episode of Useful Idiots. It's a podcast by Katie Halper and Aaron Mate. They do a pretty good job. The first half of the podcast isn't always for everyone. They are leftist, and so they do talk about issues that as libertarians we're not always the most concerned with, or we don't think are the most important. But in this particular episode, I think it's important that my audience check out the second half where they interview a doctor that was in Gaza recently, and he gets into the restrictions on different kinds of medicines going into Gaza. And what he explains is they basically only allow in pretty basic antibiotics. They don't allow in the 4th and 5th generation antibiotics that are severely needed right now in Gaza because of the number of shrapnel wounds, amputations, and other injuries that you've had that require antibiotics. But now you've had this spread of antibiotic resistant bacteria, and so without the 4th and 5th generation antibiotics, you can't treat those, and you're likely going to have a lot of Palestinians either dying or severely suffering from infections because of the restrictions on antibiotics entering into Gaza. So since October 7th, Tel Aviv has exploited and promoted several lies to justify the genocide that is being inflicted on the Palestinian people. Last month, Israel claimed 12 members of the UN aid agency UNRWA participated in the Hamas attack on Israel. The U.S. and over a dozen other Western nations cut funding to the agency based on the Israeli allegations. However, several media outlets that have reviewed Israel's dossier, which supports Tel Aviv's assertions, say it contains no evidence. Tel Aviv has asserted that Hamas command and control centers were built under critical civilian infrastructure in Gaza, such as cemeteries, the UNRWA headquarters, and Shifa Hospital, but Israel was unable to produce evidence to back their claims after having total control over the facilities. And so imagine this, there's a cemetery in Gaza. Israel has so much control over it, they're able to invite a CNN journalist to come out and take a guided tour. They let them into the tunnels, they show them the entrances, and they show him the dug up cemetery. And after that, the CNN journalist says, well, you didn't actually show me any evidence that there was a tunnel under the cemetery and there was some kind of, facilities down there that you had to destroy. And the Israeli general kind of says, well, I can't show that to you. And CNN reports that, hey, they didn't show us any proof of this. The Washington Post reported that, hey, there's no proof there's tunnels under the Shifa hospital. And yet, the U.S. just delivers no consequences to Israel for any of this. The Israeli destruction of Gaza and the recent aid have created and restriction of aid have created a humanitarian catastrophe for the 2.3 million Palestinians that live in the Strip. Food, medical supplies, clean water, and fuel are scarce. Hundreds of thousands of people are in a state of famine. And so I really just haven't been able to get a good idea of how many Palestinians are dying from non-war issues. Not that the famine isn't a result of the war, but there's a difference between being shot and killed and being starved to death. And so I feel pretty confident that the 29,000 deaths include almost all war fatalities, and we just don't know how many people are dying from other causes at this point. A couple things, more things I want to mention here. Up to date at antiwar.com, the Spotlight article is by an American doctor who recently traveled to Gaza, and this is published in the Los Angeles Times. It's been getting a lot of traction. I've seen a lot of people share it around, and particularly one of the most important things in the article that the doctor highlights is that there was a situation where Israel withdrew from an area, and Palestinians, believing it was safe to move around again, families went out into the streets. And he said that a handful, so I'm not sure how many of that is, 4 or 5, probably less than 10, children between the ages of 5 and 8 walked down to the streets with their parents and were shot, single shot to the head by an Israeli sniper. And so, I mean, there's not really words to talk about that level of cruelty, right? That you would intentionally shoot. It would be cruel enough if the snipers had shot the parents, right? But at least if they shoot the parents, there's some part in the back of your brain that says, maybe this is some kind of misinterpreted threat. Shooting not just a child, but a 5 to 8 year old child, right? You're talking 12, 13 years old or something like that. Again, not that it really is a threat, but you could picture somewhere that somebody misinterprets something, but there's nothing to misinterpret here. Shooting a sniper, shooting a child in the head is just, I mean, unacceptable is one word for it, but it really just doesn't amount to it. Not only is it a war crime, is it a murder, is it just unbelievably disgusting, but it's meant to cause the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, right? They want the people, the parents of Gaza, to get the message that your little children are not safe walking the streets in Gaza. Our snipers will shoot them. They will kill them. They will not face punishment. We will not face punishment. We will not face repercussions. The world will not care, but your children will still be dead. I think is supposed to be the message there. And so unbelievable cruelty being inflicted on the Palestinians. All right, a couple other stories before we wrap up here. Report: Israel was behind attacks on gas pipelines in Iran. All right, so Israel attacks another country in the Middle East. This one from Dave DeCamp. Israel was behind attacks on natural gas pipelines that occurred inside Iran last week, the New York Times has reported. The Times report cited 2 unnamed Western officials and a military strategist affiliated with Iran's IRGC. They said the attack, which hit 2 pipelines in the province Fars and Sharjah, required deep knowledge of Iran's energy infrastructure. The Western officials said the attack was meant as a symbolic move and didn't cause much damage, but according to Iranian officials, the attack caused disruption in at least 5 provinces across Iran. According to the Times, energy experts estimate the sabotage knocked out about 15% of Iran's daily natural gas production. And so, if the Houthis do this to Saudi Arabia, terrorism, red flags. We can't allow this. The world energy infrastructure is in danger. Warning, warning, Americans, we have to go to war. Israel does it in Iran. It was meant as a symbolic move. We're not really worried about it. You know how things are in the Middle East. It's just the level of care for certain groups of people, but not other groups of people in the Middle East is so stark in the Biden administration that ran on, being woke and caring. It is absolutely unbelievable. So Iran called the attack a sabotage and terrorist attack, but has not yet publicly blamed Israel. The military strategist affiliated with the IRGC said the Iranian government was aware that it was carried out by Israel after previous Israeli covert attacks in Iran. Iranian officials have usually waited a few days to assess the situation before blaming Israel. The Western officials said Israel was also behind an explosion at a chemical plant outside Tehran, but local officials said it was the result of an accident. And so, Iran tends to try to approach these kinds of things fairly rationally and not over the top. And so rather than kind of how it works in the West, where if anything happens, Russia, China, Iran, Houthi, Hezbollah, Hamas, right? Whoever is the villain of the day is immediately breaking news. This group carried out an attack. What will the president do? When will he respond? Kill, 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 right? Like that's the message that we're given. Where the Iranians, when something like this happens, they wait a couple days and then, they issue strong statements. They say there will be a response and things like that. But Iran doesn't go over the top and basically work themselves up into such a frenzy about this that they have to over respond, which is constantly what happens in the West. All right, next up here. Last article today. New U.S. sanctions on Houthis that block Yemen peace deal go into effect. The U.S. on Friday formally redesignated the Houthis as a specially designated global terrorist, a step that imposes new sanctions that make the implementation of the Saudi Houthi peace deal impossible. The U.S. announced the plans to impose the new sanctions last month over Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, which have only escalated since President Biden launched a bombing campaign in Yemen on January 12th. The terror designation blots the Houthis' for peace deal with the Saudis by prohibiting the payment of Yemeni civilian workers in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, which is where most Yemenis live. The workers were supposed to get paid as a part of the first phase of the deal, but the U.S. official told the New York Times that wouldn't be allowed unless the Houthis halt the Red Sea attacks. The payment of Yemeni civil workers was a major sticking point for the Houthis and Saudi negotiators over the past 2 years. The Houthis have long demanded for them to be paid using oil revenue from areas of Yemen controlled by a Saudi-backed government, but it's unclear what arrangement the two sides ultimately agreed on. The Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah, have been clear that they won't stop operations until the Israeli slaughter of Gaza comes to an end. Instead of pressuring Israel to end its brutal assault, Biden chooses to launch a new war against the Houthis, and the U.S. has been bombing Yemen nearly every day, and for over a month now. And again, no congressional approval for Congress. In fact, they haven't even funded this war yet. So it's just crazy how the Constitution matters none to the Biden administration or anybody right now. The latest strikes reported by CENTCOM hit Yemen throughout the day on Saturday. CENTCOM claimed to hit 5 Houthi targets, including an underwater drone. CENTCOM identified the anti-ship cruise missile, unmanned underwater vessel, and the unmanned surface vessel in the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen and determined they presented an imminent threat, the command said. Now, none of those missiles, of course, could hit the U.S., but since our warships are off the coast of Yemen, we could say that anything the Houthis are doing presents a threat to our soldiers. The new bombing campaign and sanctions have grave implications for Yemenis who have had some relief from the war after Saudi Arabia and the Houthis agreed to a ceasefire in April 2022. From 2015 until 2022, the brutal U.S.-Saudi-backed Saudi and UAE war against the Houthis killed at least 377,000 people, more than half of whom died due to starvation and disease that were caused by the war. So that's kind of a warning to Yemen too. When you look at the number of people who have been killed so far, we're not counting the people who have been killed from starvation, disease, and stuff like that yet, which in Yemen was at least half of the number of people who died, and most of those were children under the age of 5. All right, everybody, that'll do for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Oh, I will be on with Judge Napolitano today at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, but I will be sure to tweet out and stuff. If you don't catch it in time, he, of course, will just run the episode on his YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Peace.